Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to CareSmartz360 On Air. I am Carolina Gonzaga, account executive at CareSmartz360. Joining me today is a true game changer in the world of workforce management. We've got Cara Silletto. As the president of Magnet Culture, she's helped over 75,000 leaders tackle the turnover crisis. Now, we've all heard that young people and young talent are hard to retain, or that they're difficult, or that they don't want to work. But what if the problem isn't them? What if it is the way that we manage our workforce within our agencies? So, Kara is here to open your eyes to how leadership styles might be one of the very reasons why your best employees are walking out the door. So, get ready to shift your mindset and build a culture where everybody wants to stay, regardless of their generation. Welcome to the podcast, Kara.
Awesome. So glad to be here.
Well, I don't know how many times in my conversations day to day that retention comes up with all the tips and the tricks and also just the struggle, especially in healthcare and in particular for CareSmartz home care. So before we kind of launch into picking your brain about your expertise on retention, what can be done, and where to go from here, I'd love to know more about you and how magnet culture began and kind of the mission that you're driving from day to day.
Sure. So we just hit 13 years in business at Magnet Culture, and I actually started my career at a long-term care state association where I learned the complex regulatory and reimbursement environment in which senior care and senior living operate. And then I started, once I left that organization, I started the company as more of a generational expert. I happen to be one of the oldest millennials. I was born in 1981. And so when I started the company at age 31, 13 years ago, I was talking about the new workforce and how do we understand the way they were raised that was differently. And then we realized the reason we were bridging generational gaps was to reduce employee turnover. So since 2015, we have been focused on why people stay, why people go, how do we keep people longer. And then we've also expanded our work beyond senior care to the whole continuum of healthcare, still mostly around seniors, as far as including home care, home health, senior living, SNF, the skilled nursing and things like that. So we do most of our work there, and then we purposefully do about 25 to 30% of our work outside of healthcare because we all know that our frontline workers in particular, they industry hop. And so our competition is not just the healthcare organization down the street, but also some organizations that hire non-degreed, lower wage hourly workers, such as hospitality and casinos or distribution, warehousing, and different industries like that. So we also like to figure out what they're doing to get and keep people so that we can bring some of those best practices back to the healthcare arena. And now we do keynote speeches at a lot of the conferences around the country. We are coast to coast. And then we also go into the provider organizations and do a lot of leadership training to help, especially the baby boomer and Gen X leaders, understand the millennial and Gen Z mindset and what is going on behind the scenes of these generational dynamics.
Absolutely. And I love that you're 81. I'm 83. Shout out
Yeah.
to all of those that are us at the very, and you're right. Elder millennial is the exact term. Okay. So it sounds like very meaningful work. It sounds like you're not only, there to lead the discussions and the thoughts, doing keynotes, but as well being called upon kind of by leaders. Is there usually, do you find a catalyst to that call being made to your company asking, "Hey, I'd love to talk to you and I'd love to bring you in."
Yeah, so when we speak at the conferences, people immediately recognize that we do everything for leadership development with a generational lens. So whether we're talking about conflict resolution or emotional intelligence, everything is, do you understand this new workforce? And so I was just speaking at a conference in Missouri 2 days ago, and an executive walked up to me right afterwards and said, our leaders need to hear this perspective because we do leadership development, but it's kind of the same leadership development that would have been taught in the late 1900s. that they haven't necessarily changed their communication class and their feedback class, or how to reduce conflict and things like that. And to be a great leader today, those skills have to evolve with the workforce, particularly because today's new workforce is bringing their whole self to work. And a lot of managers say, I'm not a therapist. I don't know how to help this caregiver with their toxic mom. Like, I was taught to leave my personal drama at the door, and
Yeah.
I don't know how to deal with that, and it's not my job. And so when people hear us speak about this new workforce and have different strategies for how to communicate with them and lead them and attract them into the company, then they say, we need your help. Please come and get this message to all levels of our leaders.
What a perfect segue to my first question. I do want to say that what you've just shared has given me a lot of perspective in this moment, even about my own perspective as, an employee. Because I've always been somebody that shows up as my whole self. In fact, working in healthcare, senior living to home care technology. But I'm also a stand-up comedian. And I struggled with that because I feel like I've been ahead of the curve a little bit with the showing up as a full self, but really giving me that perspective, even just the way you described it in why it wasn't so easy to show up as I would like to. And now it's for the
Mhm.
most part celebrated, or should I say I pick employers who do see that whole self and see the value in that vulnerability and strength. And so what
Yes.
is the best way for, let's say, veteran staff to lead this new generation of workers, different types of motivators, experience, knowing that they are coming to work as their whole self rather than kind of the siloed way of the past?
Yeah, so I'd love to think bigger picture here for a moment.
Yeah.
It used to be that you could treat all of your employees the same way because that was fair, and you communicated the same way, and you praised people the same way, and you educated and onboarded the same way. And I got to tell you, that's out the window. That is not going to get and keep today's new workforce, as frustrating as it is. And I'm just going to be the bearer of bad news and tell you, managing people is harder today than it has ever been before, because they expect individualized treatment
Mhm.
and they want to be cared for the way they want to be cared for. So we actually, for years, have been referring to the workforce. Now, stay with me here. We refer to the workforce today as houseplants. And if you think about the spectrum of houseplants, you have everything from a high maintenance, very delicate orchid that needs daily attention, care, make sure you got the right lighting, the right watering, nutrients, all the things at one end, to the other end of the spectrum, which would be like a cactus. And so with our staff, you have some staff who need daily attention and affirmation and check in and more mentoring and hand holding. And then you've got folks at the other end that say, leave me alone, boss. I got this. I'm good. Don't bother me. Get out of my way. you know, and there's no right or wrong on that. But a great leader is going to be what we consider the great gardener of your houseplants, and really understand that each and every employee needs an individualized care plan from their manager. It's not much different than how we see those that we serve with caregiving, right? Each person, each client has an individualized care plan. On the customer side, we just need to flip that mindset internally and say our staff need that as well. So the best way to train the veteran staff and leaders about the new generation is to say one size no longer fits all, and we have to get to know each and every person, which takes more time and trouble and intention. But once we know them, we can then treat them the way that they want to be treated. So we're seeing today a tremendous need of more self-awareness and team awareness on leadership teams, because if you have not done things like disc assessments and emotional intelligence assessments and training and tools, then you've probably put people into leadership positions that may not be equipped to not only listen and understand their people, but also be able to flex and say, okay, well, I'm going to have to praise this
Yeah.
person this way because they're more of an introvert. I need to praise this person this way because they're more of an extrovert, and really have time. And again, I love this word intention. You have to be intentional about your leadership style with your different folks, but only if you want to keep them. If you don't care if they leave, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
But if you
Yeah.
want to keep people, you got to be more intentional and be prepared for that flexibility.
As I look at literally 4 of my husband's house plants, I love the analogy that you gave, and I also just wanna let you know that he is indeed a cactus, and I am the most needy plant in our relationship. It's interesting, again, this conversation is so meaningful to me because it's also, the job of managing people, if you're trying to build a culture of staying, has changed, and
Mhm.
forever and always, not everybody wants to be a manager or should be a manager, but now that profile of the ideal manager that can meet these differences is very different. So proceed with caution, if this is the role that you want to take on because it's not easy. And the word of, "Oh, I'm not a therapist," is just a showing of a lack of understanding of where we are today. So it's funny that I mentioned earlier that I like, as an example, like to show up as myself, but I also like to be left alone in a way. So, one size does not fit all. Seeing one
Yeah.
part of one of your employees may not mean that, oh, they fit into this profile and this is what they need. We're complex as individuals. So, what are some of those common misconceptions about younger, folks in our industry, caregivers? And, how can agencies kinda discover what their real values are?
Yeah. So, some common misconceptions are these myths that I like to bust when I speak and train. And my favorite one to bust is no one wants to work.
Oh, yeah. We hear that one all
Because
the time.
we do, and it's simply not true. It is absolutely based on perception, and it is kind of taking a tiny pool of the workforce who really does. I'm going to get in so much trouble for saying this, but I'm just going to be honest. There is a very small portion of the pool that just sucks.
Yep,
Okay,
yep,
there are some people
yeah,
who don't want to work, and they really do, want to get everything for nothing, or they want to be taken care of, or not have to work hard. And there is a portion of the workforce that's like that, but it's a much smaller pool than what a lot of managers really mean, because they say nobody wants to work. And what I have found is that when we look at how is the company onboarding people, how is the company training their leaders to understand the workforce? When I ask a leader who comes to me because they have a turnover problem, well, what's your leadership development plan look like? And how up to date is it? And what does your on ramp look like? Instead of onboarding, we call it an on ramp, which is the new hire experience. How do you really acclimate people in? Are you throwing them out by themselves too quickly and not giving them a comfortable runway and on ramp to get acclimated in? Things like that. When I start asking these questions about the culture, the leadership, the onboarding, I often find that the company says, well, we're short staffed. We just need to get them out on the floor. We need to get them out here, out in the field, and different things like that. And then they say, well, our leaders, we don't have time to do training, and whatnot. And then I get to say, well, guess what? No one wants to work, dot, 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 here. Because you're not properly onboarding people. You're not putting leaders in place that really understand them and support them and care about them, where other companies do. And so whenever somebody thinks nobody wants to work, I love to dig deeper into why is it that our particular culture is not attractive enough to get and keep people. And sometimes it even comes down to compensation. That conversation is an important one as well, because if we can't pay more, then we have to worry even more about our culture and be even better leaders and communicators and things. But we also need to be able to keep up and compete on the compensation and benefits side as well, as best we can, because that can also be a driver of why some people leave. Although it's not just that they'll go anywhere for a buck more an hour. The studies all show that people will stay for less money if they have a great leader who understands them, who values them, who appreciates them, those types of things as well. So it's got to be a balance
Yeah.
of the compensation and culture has to be in a reasonable threshold.
Yeah, for sure. Do you find that, well, in home care, like what the way that you described it, you have a retention problem, you reach out to Magnet Culture for help. And then what is the onboarding like? What is the training like? It's like, well, we don't have time for that. And so a lot of the times, you are trying to solve the turnover problem one way, but you're actually kind of reinforcing it over and over.
Hmm.
I also think about the term that the younger millennials taught me, which is the Sunday scaries, right? Like, well, how do you feel on your Sunday, the day before you go back to work after a week?
Yes.
And that is such a, not every workplace, well, no workplace is perfect. But what I am finding is that the less the Sunday scaries are in terms of like that dread, the more likely I am to stay. And that has nothing to do with things like the dollar an hour. Those things matter. But I do think that the way that our nervous system reacts to where we've got to go, isn't that such an
Yes.
indicator of whether we're more likely to stay?
Absolutely, yes. And we need to think more holistically about retention because some companies just say, oh, well, we revamped our onboarding or we redid our comp and we put in a leadership development program. And we found that some of those were either negating one another
Uh-huh.
or they just weren't in tandem. They weren't working together. So this past year, we actually released a new model, a retention framework called the Employee Retention Ecosystem. And
Okay.
it's where everybody has to work together and take ownership of their roles. So the staff have to take root in their positions and then grow within the company. The leaders, those gardeners of the house plants, they have to acclimate new hires and then cultivate their entire team ongoing. And the executives have their roles, which is to establish an attractive and protective environment and equip the leaders with the gardening tools that they need to be successful. Because if a leader is given a watering can with a big hole in the bottom, then they're not going to be very successful at getting their houseplants all the tools that they need. So, depending on who we're working with and talking to, whether it's a leader level, the office administrators, directors of nursing, and others, or is it the executive team that we're working with and we're recalibrating and restructuring? I just worked with a home health group in Tennessee, and after working with us, both with our 2-day retreat and then our executive summit, they decided to change their staffing model of how quickly do they bring on assistant directors of nursing because they were waiting too long. They were saying that their client load had to reach 65 clients at that branch before they would bring on an assistant DON, and they had so much DON turnover because once they got to 45 or 50 clients at that location, the DON was completely overloaded and completely overwhelmed. Then that person kept turning over, which meant the caregivers kept turning over. It was, kind of a cycle that they had experienced. And so they realized they needed to bring an assistant DON much sooner onto the org chart. So they changed some of their titles of their positions, they changed some of the job descriptions, they changed the financial staffing model of what they pay when for different positions. And I'm excited to see where they're headed now because they finally figured out the root cause of some of the problems was really the org chart was just off, and they couldn't get leaders to be great leaders because they were underwater all the time, and it ended up
Yeah.
being a workload crisis that they were
Yeah.
experiencing.
When you think about that assistant DON role, or even like in the senior living, and just because I spent so much time in that industry, the how some companies were so early on began to introduce this like assistant GM or executive director
Yeah.
role, and some weren't. I remember trying to break into that role and just feeling like I'm so eager, I'm so dedicated, it's not there. So there's so much that introducing that role achieves, right? It's like another milestone, another goal, and then
Mhm.
maybe mentorship. I'd love to talk about, talking about what you just said about retention. How in the home care space can a leader try to make such a role less of scheduling matrix and more of a retention champion, what are some of the ways that is it a mindset? Is it just a state of mind? Like, how do you shift it to be more of a retention champion rather than just task driven?
Yeah. So a big piece that we find that's missing is ownership of retention. So another kind of myth that we bust is that it's somebody else's responsibility. At almost all of our workshops, we start with who owns retention at your organization? Who owns it? And they'll say, oh, well, it's HR's job at the home office, or the office administrator is the, buck stops here kind of person that's ultimately responsible. Or some people say everybody owns retention. And then of course that means it's really nobody's responsibility, or they don't feel that it's theirs. They can do a lot of finger pointing. So the first piece is making sure that every person in a leadership role owns retention for their team and has that sense of ownership that, okay, these new hires coming in, I need to make sure personally that they feel acclimated into the role, into the company, into the team. And unfortunately, we have normalized being understaffed for
Mm,
so long now that we think it's okay to just push them out there by themselves quickly because I just need somebody out there. And that ends up working against us because we cut that on ramp short, and then we wonder why they don't come back for week 3. you know so we really have to take ownership as a leader and say, I need to be a part of the on ramp and make sure that I extend that on ramp. In fact, the example that I give is, have you ever been in a city, you're driving and you're unfamiliar with this city, and then you're getting on the highway and you come around an on ramp, that big curve, and when you get around the curve, you realize, oh, this on ramp is way shorter than I was expecting it to be. And then you're pushed
yeah.
into full blown traffic, speeding past you, honking their horn, and you're terrified. I mean, it's scary. I don't care how old you are. It's terrifying to have that experience when you were shoved out there before you were ready. And so that's where this on ramp concept came from, is we need to extend the on ramp for folks and make sure, particularly because today's youngest workforce does not have as much grit as previous generations. They don't have within themselves, like, I can make it through a tough day, I can do it. They have a different mentality because of the times and the age in which they were raised. And so if we don't increase their comfort and make sure that they feel prepared, they feel competent, they feel confident in the role, then we're going to push them away, because they're going to, if they're on that highway, they're going to take the first exit off because they're scared to death. And this is miserable to be blown past and be terrified on this highway. So we really need to make sure that we are providing this proper on ramp. And that's one of the best ways that any leaders can take more ownership and say, I'm going to make sure that it's a better experience for folks. And don't get me wrong, that costs money and
Yeah.
time, right? Because if you're not putting them out there independently, it's more money. And also what I talked about earlier with the assistant managers, assistant director of nursing, things like that, those cost money. And oftentimes the executives say, well, where's that money going to come from? And then we talk about the cost of their current turnover,
Yeah. I
you
was like,
know?
what's the cost
So
of onboarding people over and over again? And
it's
then them leaving in three
unbelievable.
weeks. Yeah.
Yes. And so we have a cost of turnover worksheet that is
Okay.
line item by line item of what real costs are spent if you have to replace an independent worker that
Yeah.
you need somebody else up and trained. So once you start looking at the real numbers of turnover cost,
Yeah.
then it makes sense to lengthen that on ramp and onboarding process, and to possibly put an assistant manager in place, because it will, if you get it right, it will reduce that turnover on the back end as well, and just make it a better place to work for everyone. We don't want to continue normalizing this understaffedness,
Yeah.
because it burns everybody out, and then nobody's happy and nobody's sleeping.
Yeah.
you know?
When you go through the onboarding worksheet or you are having a conversation with leaders and you can see, that their eyes are starting to understand, what you're saying, and
Mm.
really seeing the value of maybe breaking the cycle, are you finding that more leadership performance is being measured by how onboarding changes? Like, is this something that is the tide changing in terms of like, no, this is actually a performance indicator that we need to address? Because like you said, there is post-pandemic specifically, it's also like, well, turnover is inevitable. What are we supposed to do about it?
Yeah. Yeah, so I hope I'm answering your question here
Yeah.
properly, but I'll talk kind of generally about metrics and what matters and what doesn't. So we have to be really careful when you're measuring retention and you're measuring turnover. That's actually two different metrics. And in fact, one of our clients just told me the other day that their retention number and their turnover number both went up last quarter, which he didn't think was possible, but it was because they have so many people there who are deep rooted in the organization. They've been there for so long that it looks like they have really great retention because they have people who've been there 35 years. Well, that skews the numbers of
Right.
if you have, I was actually just talking to a executive this morning who said at each of their locations, it's not home health, but a similar model, that they have 10 staff in each location. And he said, we have about six that are stable all the time, deep rooted, they don't change, but the other four people in that same location just keep churning.
Gosh, and then
And
sometimes
so,
those can be related, no? I mean, you
yes.
know what I'm
So,
saying? Yeah.
yeah. So he actually said this morning they have 125% turnover, meaning, more than 10 positions a year have to be filled, but it's just these four seats that keep turning over, turning over, turning over. And so you have to kind of, in my mind, we encourage companies to take the deep rooted folks, the longer tenure folks out of the equation. Look at your new hire turnover and new hire retention. Who makes it to that magical 100 days, right? I actually saw that you had Stephen Tweed on your podcast a while back, and he is brilliant. He's a very dear friend of mine and a mentor as well. And he wrote a book about how to keep caregivers. And his study showed that if they hit 100 days, that is like the magic number that they are more likely to stay much longer. But anything less than the 100 days is where we get that constant churn. So we really have to think about the metrics of, are we measuring all of our turnover or just a little bit? And unfortunately, some companies are bonusing managers in the wrong way. They're bonusing based on, a overall retention rate. And that's not really fair to one of the offices maybe that's deeper rooted and longer tenure, that they've been around a lot longer and they have a handful of those longevity people, versus a newer location that doesn't have any deep rooted people, and they actually are keeping each new individual longer than the other office, but
Yeah.
because they have more new people, it looks like it's worse turnover. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Of There's
Yeah.
two different ways to measure that. So I think we have to be really careful. I do like putting retention and turnover metrics onto management bonuses because it brings that ownership, but you have to be
Yeah.
real careful which metrics it is, because as you know, people will only make decisions based on how that bonus is
Yeah.
delivered out and not holistically or long term if it's a short term bonus in
No,
mind.
that's great. That's really eye-opening. And, going back to the generational gap and what you just shared and clarified, I also see like one thing that comes up working, I started as a caregiver in senior living like 25 years ago or something. And some of those folks are still caregivers at the same facility, and I'm still friends with a lot of them. But that's also kind of something that's not always the case, but in general, maybe in past generations, people were more likely to stay, and then the
Mhm.
staying is just the choice. Whereas now
Yes.
we know that we have choices. There's LinkedIn, recruiters are constantly coming in, people are changing industries and creating new industries. So Just even in that difference of, 20 years from now versus today, that is a very different workforce. And so
Yeah.
how can an agency that is overwhelmed by the idea of this generational gap begin to approach this? What is some, a tip, maybe even just one actionable change or item that they could use to kind of start addressing that gap, that difference between the generations?
Yeah, so as far as the widening generational gap that we see, I love for leaders to understand that professionalism is subjective. It is your opinion whether you think purple hair and tattoos are professional or unprofessional. And I give those two examples because I used to have purple hair and I have a whole sleeve
Huh?
of tattoos
And I shaved half
under my
my
shirt.
head. I was the
Yes.
one, I shaved half my head, and I was very
Yes, exactly, exactly, right. Because we were bringing our whole self into
yes.
into work, right? So so we have to understand that professionalism is subjective, it's your opinion, and it tends to evolve over time. And the new hires coming in, honestly, I don't care if she's 25 or 45 that you're bringing in, they cannot read your mind as a leader. They do not know how that organization has always done it. And they may have never even had, let's be honest, professional role models. I have several people in my life that are in their 20s and their parents who are in their 40s or 50s never could keep a job and didn't have the grit and the stamina and the obligation to stay and things like that. So the 20 something has never seen that person get up, their parents or whomever get up every morning with an alarm clock and care about being on time and looking nice for work. Some folks, they're just looking for a mentor and a great company that will pour into them and will help them to hit the mark. They're not missing the mark on purpose, most of them. They just don't know what they don't know. So, in fact, at my first job at that association, nobody told me that I needed to keep my shoes on all day at the
Yeah,
office. So I would kick off my shoes under my desk at 3 o'clock and walk to the copier barefoot. I didn't think that was a big deal until finally
yeah,
somebody said, people are talking about your bare feet, Cara. So you might want to bring in some flats and keep your shoes on if you want to get the respect of these older workers, who had been
yeah.
there far
Or
longer
put
than
them
me.
back on before you walk out from under your desk.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So luckily I had a nice older peer come and tell me that because people were so judgy, and we are all judgy. Let's own that. But people were so judgy, and they were telling everybody at the office except me how
Yeah,
ridiculous they thought I was. They were talking about me behind my back and didn't tell me. And wearing your shoes all day was not in the handbook. Okay.
yeah,
Because I was in an office setting and they didn't think they needed to explicitly tell me that. So then everybody is real judgy, like, well, she should know better. I shouldn't have to tell her that. Who doesn't know that? And my favorite phrase of judgment, that's just common sense.
yeah,
And so a
yeah.
lot of
What
us
is
were
that then?
raised,
Yeah.
you know, how to show up and how to
Yeah,
speak to your elders and your bosses and be respectful and things like that. And that parenting style has changed. So back to answer your question, what is one simple actionable change that leaders can take is communicate the expectations. When people are missing the mark, even things like giving a 2 week notice. Some people do not know that that is expected, that that is a standard. Some people don't realize how important it is to be on time. And we have to educate not only that we want you to be on time, but here's why we want you to be on time, whether it's in the office or with a client and on a meeting, things like that. So we have to, as silly as it might sound, we have to acknowledge the obvious that you think everybody should know that. That's common sense.
yeah. Give them
And if
an
they're missing the
opportunity
mark,
first. Yeah, to understand.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And do it in a very loving way because we can't just yell at them and be like, don't you know to do this or you're being ridiculous. And instead, I like to take more of like a big sis approach, a big
Yeah.
brother approach, and say, Hey, let me let you in on a little secret about some of the unwritten expectations that our clients
I've
have
got
or
your
that our
back. Yeah, I've got
leaders
your
have.
back.
Yeah. So you're helping them. You're not bossing them of saying, you need to do this and do it a different way, but say, let me let you in on a little inside scoop here of what people are looking for in order for you to get more respect and be eligible for future pay increases and promotions and things like that as well. If you can throw in the what's in it for them,
Yep.
that helps change behavior too.
Yeah.
So,
I think too of like the common sense or what's obvious, but I wonder how many employees, caregivers don't realize that they can say if something isn't making sense or if they're not
yes.
feeling happy or safe, that,
Hmm.
like, these things can be talked about. So the unsaid is not helping anyone. If we
Yes.
approach that said with kindness, then you'll probably get better results from all areas. So
Yeah.
a good mantra overall. So I think about every time I talk about this topic, home care specifically, I always say the one thing like about working in a community and senior living is, oh, you walk in, this is kind of home away from home. It's somebody else's home. But caregivers, nurses out in the field, it's very
Yeah.
decentralized. So remote before the pandemic, they've been on their own, getting to where they need to go. And caregiving is not easy, and so they may feel extremely isolated and not as connected to those on their team. So how can an agency provide consistent support,
Mhm.
positive feedback, guidance, even if it is a very decentralized environment?
Yeah, so that's definitely a big difference between senior living and home
Yes.
health for sure. And working with other, I've got other industries and other clients who are in that space as well with remote folks. And so you just have to be much more intentional about your communication, your check-ins with people. You may have to schedule those,
Mhm.
or tell your team, if they're going to be on the road at certain times between clients, for example, tell them to call you when they hit the road and that type of thing. But you have to be in contact almost daily as a leader, just checking in. Hope you have a great day. Hope you had a great day. Let me know if you need anything. I'm free from this time to this time if you want to call me when you're on the road today. If you can't schedule in advance, but really being very intentional about that. Because think about back in the day, the water cooler talk where you would just pass by in the hallways of an office, if you ever worked in that space or even in a hospital or other healthcare setting that where everyone was in the same building, it's very different. Your caregivers are missing the water cooler time. And my team has been remote for 13 years across various states. And so we intentionally schedule check ins with one another, some team check ins and some individual check ins. They're regularly weekly or monthly. And then we also have some team happy hour type time that is scheduled for non work chat. And at the beginning of every team meeting, even if it's like a sales team meeting or whatever that team meeting is, we start with 5 minutes of how's everybody doing? Anybody want to chat about their weekend? And we call it the GBU, the good, the bad, and the ugly. If you want to share what's going on in your life, and sometimes
My
someone's
in-laws
struggling
are
with
in town.
something.
Help.
Yes, yes, exactly. Sometimes they're struggling, like, please pray for me this weekend. And sometimes they say, guess what? This happened and I'm so excited, or it was my son's birthday, and we want to celebrate together and we want to learn more about one another. So you have to, with a more remote team, intentionally build in the
Yeah.
team building time, the trust building, and the check-ins, the communication. That is important. And then also, as a leader, make sure to appreciate your folks. Now, most of the folks in the healthcare space that I work with, unfortunately, we cannot pay our caregivers the absolute top pay, that other industries can pay. And so that means that we're going to have to attract and retain even B and C players. Now, would we love to have all A players? Sure. But let's be honest, we
Yep.
can't afford all A players, okay? So we got a lot of B and C players that we depend on and we love them. If we dig way down deep, we really do appreciate that they showed up to do the job. They did a good job today. And so some of the managers in our training, I have to recalibrate their thank you meter because they were taught you only praise someone when they go above and beyond or they go the extra mile when they pick up extra shifts, then I'll thank them. But we actually teach that every leader should appreciate any job well done. And so even sending those text
Yep.
messages of great job today and good work this week, thanks for being on time all week, or thanks for showing up all week if you have an attendance problem, we have to recalibrate and say, I'm going to recognize the people who are hitting the mark and make sure they feel appreciated for doing so.
Yeah, and I also think like I know you didn't mean A type, but I also think it takes all kinds to make a good unit. And
Yes. Oh,
sometimes you need
absolutely.
people, not everybody, you don't want every single person to be a pick me, I'm ready. You do want those. I
Yes.
hear the phrase in my mind like slow and steady wins the race too. Steady,
Right.
dependable can,
Introverts and extroverts are
yeah,
all great caregivers,
absolutely.
So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I really appreciate your time today. I know that this is a topic that is on the minds of many home care agency owners and leaders, and I think that looking at it from a generational perspective is new to me, and uh, I really think that that is the highlight for me, and so I hope everybody really starts to go and think about the different generations that are they're working within. And after all, we are often caring for people from other generations and spend all sorts of time understanding that difference. And so,
Yes.
yeah, so it is important. I do see a book behind you with your name on it. I love to end by you just telling us about the book and telling us what readers might find most valuable about it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the author of Staying Power: Why Your Employees Leave and How to Keep Them Longer. And it does walk through the generational evolution of the workforce from the 80s and 90s, particularly my story as a millennial growing up and how that changed my view of the employer employee relationship.
Yeah.
And then it has some retention strategies in it. And we also have some mini books about generational dynamics and our new employee retention ecosystem. Those digital versions of those books are available at magnetvault.com. That's our hidden treasure trove of all kinds of downloadable tools, including the cost of turnover worksheet that I mentioned, and some
Oh,
other tips and tricks for HR professionals and leaders at every level. So, yeah, would love to have you dive a little deeper to hopefully broaden your lens of understanding this new generation.
well, this is awesome. You're doing important work, you and your team, 13 years and counting. And I thank you
Yeah,
so much for your time today, Kara.
thank you. Have a great day.